We call him a general. But Sun Tzu was something else entirely. He wasn't a conqueror of cities. He was a conqueror of thought. A man who rewired the nature of power itself. While other rulers clashed blades and spilled blood across broken fields, Sun Tzu raised no sword. He studied, he predicted, and then he positioned himself so that his enemies had no choice but to lose. Most men fight. Sun Tzu removed the need to. His philosophy didn't grow from glory. It grew from a deep distrust of it. Born in a fractured China, where kings smiled with poison in their sleeves and alliances were torn apart over shadows, he understood early. Force was fragile. What wasn't fragile? Fear, doubt, confusion, control. These didn't require armies, only understanding. Sun Tzu saw something most leaders still don't, that the most dangerous weapon in war is the mind of your enemy. But here's what most never learn. The Art of War wasn't just a book about battles. It was a manual for psychological domination, buried in polite phrases, veiled teachings, and elegant metaphors. When you are near, make it seem you are far. When you are far, appear near. Translation: control perception, and you control the battlefield. The deeper message was never about armies. It was about systems of obedience, misdirection as manipulation, and the illusion of invincibility. And today, those same tactics are used not just in war, but in corporate boardrooms, intelligence agencies, political campaigns, and the strategies of silent rulers. Because when the enemy sees what you let them see, you've already won.
All of us are self-made, but only the successful will admit it.
Part 1. Forged in Silence. The Birth of a Phantom Strategist. Sun Tzu didn't rise through glory. He rose through observation. There are no statues of him on horseback. No songs of great conquest. No heroic tales shouted over campfires. Just a name, a scroll, and the memory of a man who changed warfare without drawing a blade, born in a time of betrayal. Sun Tzu's early life remains a blur in history, intentionally perhaps. Some say he was born in Qi, others claim Wu. But all agree, he emerged during the spring and autumn period, one of China's most volatile eras. Dozens of kingdoms, 1,000 assassins, and a political landscape where peace was simply the moment before betrayal. Most children of that era learned to wield weapons. Sun Tzu? He learned to read men. He watched how flattery cloaked daggers, how armies lost battles before stepping onto the field, and how power could evaporate the moment it was shown too clearly. He learned that survival didn't belong to the strongest. It belonged to those who saw what others missed. He became what modern psychology might call a pattern reader, one who lives in the periphery, watching, anticipating, storing details like blades in the mind. The man with the scroll. He wandered the fractured states of China, not as a warrior, but as a ghost with an idea. When he finally presented himself to King Helu of Wu, he didn't ask for favor. He offered a system where war didn't begin with a strike, but with a shift in perception. The king was skeptical. So Sun Tzu made a wager. Give me 180 of your concubines, and I will show you the future of warfare. The experiment that made him a legend. What happened next became legend, not because of the act, but because of what it meant. He divided the women into two groups, appointed the king's favorite mistresses as their generals, then issued a simple command: march. They laughed. He repeated it. They laughed again. And then he executed both of them. The king was outraged, but Sun Tzu didn't flinch. If the instructions are clear and the troops do not obey, it is the fault of their leaders. The remaining women didn't laugh. They marched. Not because they were trained, not because they understood war, but because they understood consequence. The message buried in the march. That moment wasn't about obedience. It was about engineering clarity so precise. Disobedience became a personal liability. Sun Tzu didn't teach war. He taught the psychology of compliance, the math of power, the architecture of command that doesn't have to justify itself, because its weight is felt, not explained. From that day forward, he didn't ask for command. He was given it, not because of charisma, but because he had made a kingdom. Kneel, with a whisper and a warning. Strategic breakdown, mastering the psychology of command. Sun Tzu's origin story is a case study in mental engineering, leadership as mathematical inevitability. Here's how he did it. Study before strategy. He gathered silent data for years. His power was premeditated, not reactive. Clarity plus consequence equals compliance. He made sure that expectations were unmistakable and that consequences weren't warnings. They were executions. Predictable obedience through design. Sun Tzu didn't lead by emotion. He led by equation. If clarity is high and consequence is absolute, compliance becomes inevitable. This was psychological warfare disguised as discipline, not a general, a system in robes. A message. Made for masters, make obedience predictable, not optional. Sun Tzu's lesson wasn't how to fight. It was how to design a structure so tight, so logical, and so final that obedience becomes an act of self-preservation. Here's your edge. Make rules visible and punishments inevitable. Don't argue. Create clarity so exact that defiance feels like walking into fire. Eliminate second chances with precision. One warning creates negotiation. One consequence creates memory. Speak rarely, but build systems that speak for you. True command isn't loud. It designs silence around your will. Because when your rules echo louder than your voice, your presence becomes a law unto itself. Part 2. The Ghost General. Winning without fighting. Every battle is won before it is ever fought. Sun Tzu didn't glorify combat. He saw it as the final failure of strategy. In a world where generals measured success by blood spilled and territory seized, Sun Tzu asked a dangerous question. What if the most powerful victory leaves no scars? To him, brute force was a blunt instrument, predictable, primitive. Real power, the kind that could outlast empires, was psychological. He didn't want to destroy his enemies. He wanted to make their destruction feel like their idea. The strategy before the sword. When Sun Tzu took command of Wu's armies, they were smaller, less resourced, and often underestimated. Yet time and again, they outmaneuvered and outsmarted their rivals. Not through numbers, through anticipation. Before setting foot on a battlefield, Sun Tzu would map terrain weeks in advance, analyze enemy patrol habits, study the emotions and temperaments of rival commanders, and most importantly, control what his enemies believed about him. He weaponized misinformation. He used retreat as bait. He staged false attacks to create gaps elsewhere. One infamous encounter with the state of Chu saw Sun Tzu simulate a full retreat, abandoning camps and lighting fires to mislead scouts. The enemy, convinced Wu was fleeing in fear, pursued into unfamiliar, swampy terrain, only to find themselves surrounded by hidden forces positioned in a silent crescent. No grand charge, no rallying speech, just death, delivered in total silence. That was his genius. Where most generals saw terrain, Sun Tzu saw psychological opportunity. A foggy riverbank wasn't just a natural feature, it was a disguise. A hill wasn't high ground. It was a place to disappear. He taught that the environment wasn't something you fought in. It was something you fought with. Sun Tzu rarely showed his hand, or even his face. He trained his soldiers to behave like shadows, striking quickly and disappearing even faster. Discipline was brutal. Punishments were swift. But above all else, every movement had to mislead. He turned his entire army into a living illusion. One week, they were cowards. The next, unstoppable demons. To his enemies, it was maddening. Unpredictability became his greatest weapon. One of Sun Tzu's most chilling tactics was non-response. When surrounded by threats, he would often do nothing. No messengers, no formations, no signals. He let the absence of movement create panic. His enemies couldn't read him because he refused to be readable. And in that confusion, they collapsed internally. Commanders began turning on each other. Scouts lost morale, and before the first blow was ever struck, the army had already lost. If your opponent is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak, that he may grow arrogant. Sun Tzu didn't just win battles. He orchestrated the collapse of certainty until his enemies were fighting ghosts, shadows, and themselves. Strategic breakdown. Mental warfare over military might. Sun Tzu's greatest victories were psychological collapses disguised as warfare. He didn't just prepare for battle. He pre-wired his enemies to lose before they stepped foot on the field. Let's break it down. Misdirection as mastery. He used illusion, retreat, and silence to disorient. His enemies reacted to the wrong threats while walking into real ones, weaponizing the environment. Everything, mud, mist, moonlight, became tools. He fought like nature itself, elusive, cold, and everywhere at once. Preemptive collapse. He studied minds, not just tactics. He identified fears, flaws, and overconfidence, then triggered them at the worst possible moment. This was more than generalship. It was neural warfare before the term existed. A message made for masters. Control the fight before it begins. Sun Tzu's doctrine still applies in modern power dynamics. Don't overpower, outposition. Don't crush, confuse. Here's your edge. Turn unpredictability into a signature. When people can't read you, they overthink. Overthinking leads to mistakes. Mistakes create advantage. Control space like it's a weapon. Whether it's a boardroom, a negotiation, or a battlefield, design the environment so your enemy walks into your outcome. Make silence speak louder than action. Say less. Respond slower. Let your lack of panic become their panic, because when someone fears what you might do, you've already done enough. Part 3. The art of disappearance. The power of not being there. Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Sun Tzu's genius didn't lie in what he built. It lay in what he withheld. In a time when warriors earned glory by planting their flags in conquered soil, Sun Tzu's greatest victories came from never showing up at all. To him, form was a weakness. Anything that could be seen could be studied. And anything that could be studied could be outplayed. So instead, he taught his students to master a terrifying art. Erasure. Invisibility isn't cowardice, it's control. Sun Tzu's campaigns weren't defined by where he went. They were defined by where he refused to go. Entire armies would be stationed to block him, only to discover, days later, that he'd slipped behind them, unseen, and conquered their supply lines without a single confrontation. There were times when he didn't fight at all. Instead, he allowed silence to rot morale. Spies would report nothing, commanders would grow restless, and fear would set in. What is he planning? Why is he so quiet? Why hasn't he attacked? And in that void, commanders started making mistakes. They moved too early. They pulled troops from key positions. They let panic do what an army never could. Weaken them from the inside. Sun Tzu's legend grew not from his presence, but from his impossible ability to vanish. They said he could slip through enemy lines without disturbing a single leaf, that he once positioned troops so quietly, A commander marched within 50 feet of an ambush and never noticed. But this wasn't magic. It was orchestration. Every part of his strategy was designed to leave nothing to read. No patterns, no noise, no consistency. He removed identity from his formations. His scouts dressed as farmers. His traps were made from broken wagons, moss, and mist. He didn't want his enemy to see him. He wanted them to see themselves over and over until their own imagination became their destruction. Sun Tzu understood something few ever master. Presence creates expectation. Absence creates fear. He manipulated the idea of non-existence until his very silence became the attack. A missing general, an empty road, a quiet forest. These weren't signs of peace. They were warnings, louder than horns, sharper than blades. Strategic breakdown, silence as strategy, disappearance as dominance. This wasn't evasion, it was inversion. Sun Tzu didn't hide to avoid battle. He disappeared to let fear evolve into prophecy. Here's how he weaponized disappearance. Withholding movement to induce overreaction. His silence created unease. Unease created urgency. Urgency led to mistakes. Erasure of predictability. No rhythm, no logic, no ritual. His unpredictability made him unknowable, and the unknowable is terrifying. Implied threat as psychological anchor. His enemies couldn't focus because they feared what might be there more than what was. This is psychological dominance at its peak. Power that doesn't touch, but still alters. A message made for masters. Let absence speak louder than action. To disappear is not to retreat. It is to haunt, to unnerve, to make your enemy feel your presence even in silence. Here's your edge. Stop broadcasting your every move. The less people know, the more they fear. The imagination is your co-conspirator. Control how they don't see you. Curate your absence like a weapon. Silence is not passive, it's positional. When your opponents begin to hesitate because of what you might do, you've already beaten them. Let their uncertainty do the work for you. Because when you can win, by not being there at all, you've stepped into the highest form of power. Part 4. The Battlefield as Illusion, Designing Reality. All warfare is based on deception. To most generals, the battlefield is a space for strategy. To Sun Tzu, it was a stage, and his soldiers were actors. He understood something few dared admit. Facts rarely matter in war. Belief does. Belief decides morale. Belief shapes fear. Belief determines whether someone fights or flees. And belief, Sun Tzu realized, is malleable. So he didn't just fight battles. He designed them. The engineer of illusion. Sun Tzu would reshape terrain, plant false camps, and stage weapon displays to make his army seem larger or more desperate, depending on what would most confuse the enemy. His soldiers were trained to act injured, move in fake patterns, and even leave behind evidence to send the enemy down false roads. There are reports of Sun Tzu spreading rumors through captured scouts, dressing soldiers in the uniforms of retreating enemies, lighting fires on empty hills to suggest phantom legions. He created illusions not just to deceive enemy commanders, but to infect their entire command chain. One rumor, one misread signal, and an entire army would shift formation, chasing shadows instead of preparing for the real attack. Perception replaced intelligence, and with every false move, the enemy wrote their own defeat. But Sun Tzu didn't stop at creating illusions. He created fog, mental, emotional, and strategic. He knew that clarity made men brave, so he trained his generals to introduce contradictory intelligence, send mixed signals, leak just enough truth to make a lie convincing. The result? Armies that no longer trusted their maps, their messengers, even their own scouts. They became mentally disarmed, long before the first spear was thrown. the reality-bending trap. The illusion didn't just confuse, it reshaped choice. By the time enemies thought they saw the truth, they were already inside a trap designed by lies. One army fled from what they thought was a 30,000-strong invasion. In reality, Sun Tzu had only 8,000 troops, half hiding in hollowed-out wagons, making twice the noise, and wearing the banners of 12 different regiments. The battle never happened. The enemy retreated in panic. They surrendered to a myth, because when perception becomes reality, reality becomes irrelevant. Strategic breakdown. Controlling the narrative. Sun Tzu didn't conquer his enemies. He rewrote the script they were acting in. Here's how he engineered victory through illusion, manipulated visibility. What he showed mattered less than when and why he showed it. Controlled internal dialogue. The enemy began talking themselves out of resistance because their own analysis became corrupted. Weaponized the mind's need for closure. He gave his enemies just enough evidence to leap to the wrong conclusions, and they acted on those conclusions with full confidence. This wasn't deception. It was narrative control. A message made for masters, confused to control. Sun Tzu proved a terrifying truth. People don't act on truth. They act on what they believe is true. If you control belief, you control outcomes. Here's your edge. Don't just win. Make it look like destiny. Frame your presence as inevitable. Victory becomes narrative, not outcome. Design false patterns. Let others chase your decoys while you walk undetected through the side door. Give them enough truth to trust the lie. Credibility is a costume. Dress the illusion in facts, and they'll never question it. Because when you bend their reality just far enough to be invisible, you haven't just won the battle. You've won the story. Part 5. Fear as a system of power. Designing submission. When the enemy is relaxed, make them toil. When full, starve them. When settled, make them move. Fear isn't a symptom of war. In Sun Tzu's hands, it was a weapon, refined, targeted, and deployed before the first arrow was ever fired. He understood something most commanders feared to admit. Fighting costs resources. Fear costs nothing. Where others sought dominance through strength, Sun Tzu sought submission through uncertainty. He didn't want enemies to kneel because they were weak. He wanted them to kneel because their imagination broke them first. Sun Tzu created entire campaigns around making people afraid of what they couldn't see. He used fear like architecture. He left trails of half-burned villages and strategically placed corpses, designed not to demoralize, but to implant questions. Where is he now? Why is this untouched? Why was that left behind? He created ghost trails, leaving camps full of meals still cooking, to imply that soldiers vanished mid-step. He scattered decoy messengers, each delivering slightly different warnings to opposing commanders, sowing paranoia between allies. These weren't battlefield tricks. They were psychological infections. Once fear took root, the enemy began to shrink themselves. Soldiers questioned orders. Leaders held back reinforcements. Armies moved late, or not at all. They were still alive, but already losing. Sun Tzu didn't just use fear once. He made it reliable. Like a behavioral scientist, he studied how fear affected choices, then built predictable loops into his tactics. Surprise ambushes would happen at specific intervals, training enemies to expect pain, but never know when. Entire villages would be spared except for one house, to imply surgical cruelty. Everyone became afraid they'd be next. He created systems of terror so efficient, they ran without him, like a machine of nightmares, programmed once and left to run on its own. What made Sun Tzu's fear tactics so effective wasn't just cruelty, it was control. He allowed just enough mercy to make enemies believe they still had options. But that was the final trap. When enemies fled, they ran into ravines. When they surrendered, they were taken in, only to become bargaining tools later. This wasn't about violence. It was about showing people their choices were already chosen. By him. Strategic breakdown. Fear as a feedback loop. Sun Tzu didn't inspire terror. He installed it. Here's how he turned fear into a system. Inconsistent cruelty equals maximum anxiety. Predictable pain becomes manageable. Unpredictable pain becomes paralyzing. Weaponized rumor and silence. His enemies filled in the blanks with their worst-case scenarios. He never had to confirm or deny anything. Fear, as time delay, sabotage. His tactics didn't just weaken his enemy now. They made them weaker for the next 3 battles. This was power that lived beyond presence. He didn't just defeat armies, he altered behavior. A message made for masters. Control their fear, control their future. Most people use fear reactively. Sun Tzu used it proactively, as a strategy of sustained advantage. Here's your edge. Let uncertainty do your dirty work. Never confirm everything. What they imagine is more terrifying than anything you say. Use irregular response to keep them off rhythm. Be unpredictable with pressure. Fear grows in the space between attacks. Never offer full clarity. When people don't know where they stand, they obsess over how to stand. That's control. Because once fear is installed, you don't need to fight the enemy. They'll fight themselves. Part 6. Legacy of the Invisible Empire. How power became philosophy. A leader leads by example, not by force. Sun Tzu died over 2,500 years ago. No tomb has been confirmed. No monument stands over his grave. And yet, his influence has outlived emperors, empires, and even entire civilizations. Because Sun Tzu didn't seek immortality through legacy. He designed something stronger. Influence without attribution. While other warlords carved their names into stone, Sun Tzu carved his strategy into human behavior. He understood that the true battlefield wasn't ground, it was culture. So he didn't just leave behind tactics. He embedded a way of thinking. That victory doesn't need violence. That power, when invisible, is more absolute. That fear, silence, and misdirection can govern nations long after swords are sheathed. Sun Tzu's real victory wasn't against armies. It was against the human tendency to fight too loudly. Throughout history, his teachings have appeared like ghosts. Machiavelli used Sun Tzu's ideas as the foundation for The Prince, retooling his manipulative logic into political doctrine. Napoleon Bonaparte openly studied his scrolls, reshaping European warfare through anticipation and momentum. Modern intelligence agencies, from the CIA to Mossad, still cite his principles. Win without confrontation, destabilize without detection. Even in the digital age, startups use his methods to defeat giants. Political campaigns engineer perception traps. Cybersecurity firms use deception grids modeled after his ambush philosophy. Sun Tzu is in the boardroom. He's in the ad campaign. He's in your inbox, your negotiation, your opponent's silence. You may not know you're playing his game, but you're playing it. Sun Tzu's ultimate feat was this. He built an empire with no soldiers. His words became software for power, copied across cultures, time zones, and languages, until every modern strategist, unknowingly, echoes his code. He didn't need loyalty. He needed application. And that's what he got. Strategic breakdown. Power that doesn't ask for credit. Sun Tzu's genius was not just in being effective. It was in becoming untraceable. Let's break down how he created legacy without name. He hid the self behind the system. His strategies were adopted by kings and killers alike, not as homage, but as default settings. He made his methods adaptable. His teachings were modular, applicable to war, politics, business, even parenting. He made power viral. Like a meme long before the internet, His ideas spread by utility, not loyalty. This is influence at its most evolved. Ideas that no longer need the man who made them. A message made for masters. Become the blueprint. Sun Tzu's final lesson isn't how to fight, manipulate, or dominate. It's how to outlive relevance itself. By designing power so elegantly, it becomes invisible. Here's your edge. Stop chasing credit. Start embedding value. People forget who said it. They remember what works. Design systems that survive you. If it only works when you're there, it's not real power. It's ego. Don't build empires of recognition. Build empires of behavior. Legacy is when your absence still governs the room. Because when your ideas operate without your name, you haven't just built strategy, you've become it.